I'm Captain Martin Hoffman, United States Army. I was deployed under NATO command near the German border during that really bad winter. If you've never tried to guide a convoy of trucks through freezing rain and icy roads when it's barely 20 degrees out, you can't really understand what cold feels like. It's a different kind of difficult. It makes you numb. It makes you question things. That morning, I thought I was just doing my job and following the rules. By the time night came, I realized I had put my whole career at risk just to do one decent thing. We were on the last stretch of a 70-mile humanitarian mission, escorting trucks filled with supplies like blankets, medicine, and food to refugee camps outside a small town. The roads were a total mess, just slush and black ice. My soldiers were tired, their faces chapped and red from the wind, their hands stiff even inside their gloves. Command had already called us twice on the radio. The orders were very clear. No stops. We had to keep the convoy moving. There were still reports of bandit activity in the area. When people get desperate, they do desperate things. But that's when I saw them. It was a woman and a little boy, probably 6 or 7 years old, just standing on the side of the road near an old broken fence. The kid was wearing a coat that was way too big for him, and the woman had a scarf that looked like it was frozen solid. They weren't trying to wave us down or yelling for help. They were just standing perfectly still, like they had already accepted that nothing good was going to happen. My driver, Private Miller, said quietly, "Sir, we're not supposed to stop." I didn't say anything for a long second. The radio crackled again. It was another warning, this time about our fuel levels and how much daylight we had left. I knew the regulations. You don't break the convoy for civilians. Every minute we're stopped is a risk. But I couldn't get the image of that kid out of my head. Something about his eyes, just wide and empty, like he didn't expect anyone to help. I clicked my helmet mic, pull the truck over. Miller looked at me like I was insane. "Captain, with all due respect, just pull over." We slowed the truck down, the tires slipping on the ice. I got out, my boots making a crunching sound in the snow. The cold air felt sharp against my face. I walked over to them, pulling out one of my own MRE packs. It was the last one I had. The woman tried to say something, but her lips barely moved. She didn't speak English, and she was too cold and hungry to even try. She just pointed at the boy and then at her own stomach. I didn't really think about it. I just ripped the package open and handed it to them. "Eat this," I said, trying to speak slowly and clearly. The boy just stared at it, not moving, until his mother nodded at him. He started eating, but his hands were shaking badly. Back at the truck, Miller hissed into the radio, "Captain, we're totally exposed out. Here." "I know," I said. "Just give me one more minute." The woman reached out and grabbed my hand. Her skin felt like ice, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She didn't say a word, just looked right at me and nodded her head once. I'll never forget that. It wasn't really a thank you. It was something else. It was like she was just seeing me as another person, in a place where things like that were easily forgotten. I put my glove back on and stepped back. "Try to stay near the trees," I told her, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone would get through. Then I waved Miller to get moving. The truck engine complained as we started moving again, and the falling snow quickly hid them from view as we drove away. When we got back to the base that night, some of the other soldiers were joking that I was finally going soft. Miller didn't mention the stop in his official report, but news gets around fast when you're in a small unit like that. My Lieutenant Costa took me aside. "Captain," he said, "you know the rules. Do you really want to get yelled at by high command just because you wanted to be a nice guy?" I just shrugged. "If they ask me about it, I'll take the blame." He just shook his head. "You're a good officer, Hoffman. Don't let that get you hurt." I couldn't sleep that night. The wind was hitting the tent so hard it sounded like it was alive. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I just saw the boy's face and the woman's nod. I told myself I did the right thing, but right isn't always a clear-cut word in the Army. 2 days after that, a new directive came down. Command was officially investigating violations of convoy protocol. Somebody had reported an unscheduled stop. My name was on that report. I figured I was going to get a formal reprimand or maybe even lose rank. I practiced what I would say. I decided I'd just be honest. Sir, I couldn't just let a kid freeze to death. The Army is supposed to be about honor, after all. But when Major General Cole's assistant came to my tent, he didn't say anything about punishment. The general wants to see you personally, he said. Tomorrow, Oro 800. I felt my stomach drop. Generals don't call captains to their office unless something very good or very bad is happening. That night, I spent an hour ironing my uniform, making sure the creases were perfect. I shined my boots, checked my ribbons, and went over every possible thing that could happen in my head. Maybe I was just getting transferred, or maybe they were going to use me as an example for everyone else. As the sun started to come up, I looked out over the motor pool. There were rows of trucks, all covered in frost, and soldiers moving around in the cold morning steam. The cold didn't bother me anymore. I was just numb to it. I thought about the woman and the boy, wherever they were, and hoped they were okay because I had broken the rules. I found myself saying a little prayer, something I hadn't done in a very long time. Please, let that have meant something. When I got to the headquarters building, the guard at the door saluted. Captain Hoffman, General Cole is waiting for you. I went inside. My heart was pounding in my chest. The building was an old German administrative office that NATO was using for its command center. The heaters in the building were making loud clanking noises, and the whole place smelled like stale coffee and vehicle exhaust. Every step I took on the hard floor seemed to echo, and I felt like the noise was announcing exactly what I'd done. General Cole's assistant, a young lieutenant who looked like he ironed his fatigues, led me down the hall. You're early, Captain, he said quietly. The general appreciates punctuality. I tried to smile, but my face felt stiff. Yes, Lieutenant. He stopped by a big wooden door, knocked twice, and then opened it. Captain Martin Hoffman, sir. Send him in, a calm voice replied. I walked into the office and saluted sharply. The room was warm, but my hands were shaking a little. General Cole was standing behind his desk. There were no awards or family photos, just maps, reports, and a small space heater humming in the corner. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-50s, and he had a way of filling the room just by being there. At ease, Captain, he said. Have a seat. I sat down. I could feel my pulse beating in my neck. The general looked at a file on his desk. Convoy 17, 2 weeks back, route Delta Kilo. You stopped the convoy for civilians. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, I said. You're aware that's a direct violation of protocol. Yes, sir. He just looked at me for a long time, not like he was angry, just like he was trying to figure me out. Why? He asked. That was the question I kept asking myself. I could have lied. I could have made up an excuse about the vehicle or the radio, but I didn't. Sir, I said slowly. There was a woman and a child. They were freezing. I had one meal pack left. I gave it to them. He didn't react. You jeopardized the convoy for one meal pack. I jeopardized nothing, sir. We were stopped for less than 60 seconds. My team was on high alert. No one was harmed. Cole leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Captain Hoffman, you're a good officer. Your file is full of compliments. You're disciplined, you're smart. But in this uniform, compassion can get people killed. I looked him right in the eye. Understood, sir, but I joined the Army to serve, not to turn my back on people dying in the snow. The room was quiet. I could hear a clock ticking somewhere. Then, unexpectedly, he actually smiled. Just a little. You sound just like I did 20 years ago. That surprised me. Sir? Afghanistan, he said. Winter of '09. I had a team leader give his gloves to a local boy after a sandstorm. He got frostbite and lost 2 fingers. Never complained about it, said it was worth it. I didn't know what to say to that. Cole Basti, Cole closed the file. You're not going to be punished, Captain. But be careful what you think heroism looks like out here. It rarely looks clean. Yes, sir. He nodded toward the door and, "You're dismissed." I stood up, saluted, and started to leave. Just before I got to the door, he spoke again. "One more thing. Where exactly did you stop?" "It was near the east fence line, about 2 kilometers past Checkpoint Charlie, sir." He wrote that down, still not looking at me. "Thank you." I left his office feeling a lot lighter, but also a little uneasy. Why did he want to know the exact location? I figured he was just double checking the report, but the way he asked, it felt like there was more to it. Outside, Miller was waiting by the trucks, blowing on his hands to keep them warm. "So, did he tear you a new one?" he asked. "Not exactly," I said. "He asked about the location." Miller frowned. "That's weird." "Yeah." The rest of that day felt long. The snow had eased up, but the cold hadn't. I threw myself into logistics work, fuel reports, ration counts, maintenance logs, anything to keep from thinking. Still, every time I glanced toward the tree line beyond the base, I saw a flash of that woman's scarf in my mind. That night, I was sitting outside the barracks, drinking bad instant coffee that tasted like rust. Sergeant Russo, one of the older NCOs, sat down next to me and lit a cigarette. "Heard the general called you in," he said. "Yeah." "Bad?" "No, just strange." Russo blew out a cloud of smoke. "You did right, Captain. Some of us forget what that means." I looked up at the stars, which were faint through the haze. "Maybe, but command doesn't always agree." He smirked. "Command's just people with bigger desks. Doesn't make them right." We sat there for a while without talking. The cold was getting through my uniform. Somewhere in the dark, a generator kicked on. 2 days later, another email came. "NATO command announces the arrival of distinguished guests. Security to be heightened. All officers on standby." I didn't think much about it. Diplomats and politicians came through all the time. But when my name appeared again on the morning roster with a note, "Report to Command HQ, 0900, I felt that same weight settle in my gut. "What's this about?" Miller asked as I tightened my collar. "No idea," I said. "Maybe they finally decided what to do with me." He grinned. "If they're giving out medals for feeding civilians, maybe I should have stopped too." "Don't jinx it." When I walked back into headquarters that morning, the same lieutenant greeted me. "General Cole is expecting you, Captain." And he hesitated. "We have visitors today." "Visitors?" He just nodded toward the door. "You'll see." Inside, I heard voices murmuring. Then a child laughed, a high, soft sound that was so out of place it made my heart stutter. I froze in the hallway, my hand on the doorframe. That sound didn't belong here, not in a command post built on rules and silence. "Captain Hoffman," the general's voice called from inside, calm and measured. "Come in." I stepped inside the office, and for a second, I didn't recognize the space. The maps were gone from the wall, replaced by a single blue NATO banner. A coffee pot was steaming on the side table. And standing beside Major General Cole was a woman with a scarf around her neck and a small boy clinging to her coat. The world seemed to narrow, my vision tunneled. That scarf, those eyes, that child. My mouth went dry. I barely managed to salute. "Captain Martin Hoffman reporting as ordered, sir." The general's voice was steady. "At ease." "Captain." He turned to the woman, his tone softening in a way I hadn't heard before. "My dear, this is the officer I told you about." She smiled at me faintly, nervously, and then said something in German. The boy peeked from behind her and waved. I stood frozen, unsure if this was a dream or some strange trap. My thoughts were all jumbled. How could she be here? Why was she with him? Was I in trouble? The general looked between us. "Captain, I owe you an explanation." He gestured toward the chairs. I sat down carefully, every muscle tight. "My wife, Sarah," he began, "is part of a NATO humanitarian team based near our convoy routes. 2 weeks ago, she and her escort vehicle were separated in the storm. Communications went down. We assumed the worst. He paused. His voice caught slightly before he continued. They were stranded for nearly 36 hours in that cold. My breath caught. She told me someone stopped, he said. A soldier gave her and my son food when everyone else drove by. I looked at the woman again. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. You, she whispered in a heavy accent. You give food for my boy? I swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am, I didn't know who you were. The general's lips twitched, half smile, half disbelief. That's what makes it matter, Captain. He reached for his wife's hand. She didn't tell me right away. She wanted to find you herself to thank you. I told her soldiers don't do this for gratitude. I didn't know what to say. My hands were trembling in my lap. Sir, I managed. I was just doing what anyone... He interrupted gently, but no, Captain. You did what most wouldn't, and I've been asking myself what that says about the rest of us. The room went silent. The sound of the boy's small boots scuffing the floor filled the space. He stepped forward and handed me something, a small, wrinkled chocolate wrapper. He keep it, the woman said softly. From that day, he say, soldier gave him hope. That did it. My throat closed. I took the wrapper carefully, like it was a medal. The general cleared his throat, trying to reassemble his command composure. Captain Hoffman, you didn't just feed my family. You reminded me that regulations mean nothing without humanity behind them. We lead better when we remember why we lead. I felt the air leave my lungs. Thank you, sir. I only did what felt right, mate. Only did what felt. Smiled slightly. That's the kind of instinct this army can't train, but desperately needs. Then his tone shifted, quiet, thoughtful. You risked reprimand for compassion. That's rare. I've been buried in rules long enough to forget what it looks like. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered something. She nodded, and they both stepped back. The general stood and straightened his uniform. Captain Hoffman, I want to offer you something. He held up a hand, but no, not a medal. Walk with me. We moved down the corridor. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel from the nearby runway. He spoke as we walked, his voice low. When I was your age, I thought leadership meant never showing weakness, that compassion made you soft. Then my wife went missing, and I realized it's the only thing that matters. He stopped near a window overlooking the motor pool. Those trucks, those soldiers out there, they'll forget half of what we order them to do, but they'll remember every act of decency they see from a superior. I nodded. Yes, sir. He turned to me. I won't forget this, Captain. Not because you saved my family, but because you reminded me what the word soldier still stands for. I didn't trust my voice enough to respond. I just saluted. He returned it, crisp and silent. When I walked out of headquarters, the cold bit at my cheeks, but it didn't feel cruel anymore. Miller was leaning against the Humvee, chewing on a piece of gum. Well, he asked. I exhaled slowly. Let's just say compassion's not off the record anymore. He grinned. So I shouldn't tell anyone you got promoted to saint? Not yet. We laughed, but my chest felt tight with something deeper than relief. It was gratitude, maybe, or humility. The kind of feeling you don't talk about in the army because words can't carry it. That night, I lay in my cot staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the hum of the heaters. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of snow or guilt. When I woke before dawn, there was frost on the edges of my blanket and sunlight creeping through the canvas. I found the small chocolate wrapper still in my pocket. I pressed it flat and tucked it inside my journal. I didn't know it yet, but that little piece of foil would mean more to me than any decoration the Army could ever give. 2 weeks passed before I saw Major General Cole again. The mission tempo picked up, and our convoy schedules doubled. The snow had softened into a constant drizzle, muddy, gray, endless. I thought the incident was behind us. Maybe the general had said his piece and we'd all move on. Then the orders came through. All senior officers report to main hangar for formal briefing. Dress uniforms required. Dress uniforms in that weather felt cruel, but orders were orders. The air smelled like wet metal as I buttoned my coat, shined my shoes, and fixed my ribbons. The mirror in the barracks washroom showed a face that looked older than a month ago. The eyes didn't flinch anymore. Maybe they'd learned to expect surprise. The hangar was cleared out, the floor swept clean, rows of chairs faced a makeshift stage draped with NATO flags. I took a seat near the back with the other captains. Miller shot me a quick look, half teasing, half proud. The general entered to polite applause. He wasn't a man who enjoyed ceremony, but that morning he carried a certain calm, a warmth I hadn't seen before. Beside him stood the same woman from that frozen road. She wore a neat gray coat, her hair pinned back, the faintest smile on her lips. Her son, now in a clean wool sweater, sat quietly on a chair near the podium. I felt the air thin in my lungs. General Cole began speaking. 2 weeks ago, during a severe storm, a NATO convoy under my command faced impossible conditions. One of our officers made a decision, one that broke regulation but preserved something more important: humanity. I shifted uncomfortably. The captains glanced around. Nobody said my name, but I knew where this was going. "Captain Hoffman," he said suddenly, front and center. Every head turned. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. As I rose and marched forward, the general motioned for me to stand beside him. "This officer," he continued, "reminded me and all of us that compassion is not weakness. It is strength in its purest form." He turned to the woman beside him. "Captain Hoffman, I believe you already know my wife." The room froze, and for a heartbeat, nobody breathed. The woman smiled softly. "We meet before," she said in accented English. "Snow, cold, you give food." My throat closed up. "Yes, ma'am, I remember." General Cole looked at me with quiet pride. "You didn't know who she was when you helped her. That's what makes this worth more than any commendation." He gestured to an aide who stepped forward with a small case. Inside was a silver medal, not for valor, not for combat, but for humanitarian service. He pinned it above my left breast pocket himself. As he stepped back, he said in a low voice, only I could hear, "You saved my family, Captain. But you also saved a part of me I'd forgotten." I tried to answer, but my voice caught. All I managed was, "Thank you, sir." He smiled, just a trace. "Meet my wife." The crowd chuckled softly, not out of humor, but out of release. The tension dissolved like frost in sunlight. His wife stepped forward, shook my hand, and said, "You remind me why good people wear that uniform." I don't remember the rest of the ceremony clearly. Applause blurred into the hum of the heaters, faces blended. But I do remember her boy, how he stood straight-backed, hand over his heart as the anthem played. Later, as people mingled, the general caught up to me near the coffee table. "Captain," he said quietly, "you ever wonder what you'll remember about all this 10 years from now?" I thought for a moment. "Probably the cold." He chuckled. "You'll remember more than that. You'll remember the look on someone's face when you gave them hope." He turned away before I could reply, joining his wife and son. Watching them together, the way his hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder, I realized that my small act had rippled outward in ways I'd never grasp. Miller appeared at my side holding 2 paper cups. "You just got pinned by a major general. Feel taller yet?" "Maybe a little," I said. He grinned. "Well, sir, next time you break the rules, remind me to be standing nearby. Might rub off on me." I laughed softly. "Don't count on it." Outside, the drizzle had turned back to light snowflakes drifting lazily across the tarmac. I stepped into it, letting the cold sting my cheeks. Somewhere in the distance, a transport engine hummed to life. The metal felt heavy on my chest. Not from its weight, but from what it meant. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the reminder that in a world trained for conflict, kindness still had a place. I looked down at my gloved hands, remembering that frozen moment on the road, the silent handshake that had changed everything. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Germany, I smiled without hesitation. After the ceremony, things returned to their routine rhythm. Convoys, reports, frozen mornings, coffee that tasted like radiator water. But nothing really felt the same. Word of the medal spread quickly, and with it came quiet nods in the mess hall, small smiles from people I barely knew. Soldiers didn't gush about feelings, but you could feel respect shift like a current. Still, a strange restlessness stayed with me. When I lay in my cot at night, I kept thinking about the general's words, how kindness had reminded him what leadership meant. It was humbling, but also uncomfortable. I hadn't done anything grand, I'd just stopped. Why did that simple decision feel heavier than combat missions I'd survived? Maybe because it forced me to look at myself, not the rank, not the ribbons, but the person underneath the uniform. One evening, I was walking back from the motor pool when I heard a voice behind me. Captain Hoffman? It was the general's wife, Sarah. She stood by a jeep, her coat buttoned to her chin. The air smelled like snow again. Ma'am, I said, saluting out of instinct. She laughed softly. Please, no salute. I'm not officer. Habit, ma'am. She smiled and gestured for me to walk with her. I want to say thank you again, properly. You don't have to, ma'am. I just did what anyone should have. She shook her head. No, many saw us. No one stopped. You did. You risk rule for stranger. My son, he talk about you every day. He tell people the soldier who shared his food. I didn't know how to respond. Compliments were harder to handle than orders. I'm glad you're both safe, I managed. She nodded slowly. When my husband told me who you were, I cry. Not because he is powerful man, because I see what good power can do when it meets good heart. Her words hit deeper than she knew. We walked in silence for a bit, boots crunching in the snow. She stopped at the edge of the compound fence and turned to me. In war, sometimes people forget to be human. You did not forget. She offered her hand again. That same quiet handshake, only this time it wasn't desperate or cold. It was warm, alive. When she left, I stood there for a long moment, watching her walk toward the lights of the command tent. For the first time, I realized I didn't feel guilty anymore. I felt centered. The next morning, General Cole called me into his office again. Captain Hoffman, he said, gesturing toward a chair. I've been reviewing your field reports. You've shown exceptional judgment under stress. Thank you, sir. He studied me for a moment. I'd like you to take over logistics coordination for the next NATO relief column. It's a leadership role, more responsibility, less sleep. I blinked. Sir, are you sure? He smiled faintly. You've proven you can balance hard rules and discipline. That's rarer than you think. I accepted the assignment, even though I knew it would mean longer hours and colder nights. Something in me wanted to prove worthy of that trust. Later that week, while reorganizing supply manifests, I found an old field letter in my gear, a half-written note to my father that I'd started months ago and never finished. Dad had served 30 years in the Army before retiring. We hadn't spoken much lately. He'd always believed emotion was a liability. Lead with your head, not your heart, he used to say. Heart gets you hurt. I looked at the blank page, thought of that woman and her son, and began to write. Dad, you once told me mercy has no place in command. I thought you were right until Germany. I learned that leadership isn't about power. It's about remembering people. Maybe I finally understand what you meant about honor. It's not the medals. It's what you do when no one will ever know. I signed it, sealed it, and slipped it into the outgoing mail pouch. Days later, as we prepped for another mission, I noticed the general watching the troops load trucks. His son stood beside him, small hands stuffed in his coat pockets. General Cole caught my eye and gave a small nod. Not the kind of nod between a superior and subordinate, but between equals who'd shared something unspoken. That night, the wind returned, howling through the cracks in the tent. I sat by the heater, staring at the medal pinned inside my journal. I'd never worn it again. It didn't feel like something to display. It felt like a reminder to stay human in a profession that tried to sand the humanity out of you. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and patient. I closed my eyes and listened to it settle on the canvas, the same rhythm as breathing. In the silence, I thought about everything that had happened: the storm, the handshake, the meeting in the hangar, and realized it wasn't about recognition. It was about returning to something simple and timeless: decency, the thing my father had tried to teach me in his own rigid way, the thing that bound every good soldier to something larger than orders. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I wrote in my journal, not as an officer, but as a person trying to stay worthy of that word. The mail truck came through a week later, kicking up mud and half-melted snow as it rolled into camp. It was the kind of morning where the fog refused to lift, and every sound felt muffled by the cold. Soldiers gathered like kids around a Christmas tree as the clerk handed out envelopes. I wasn't expecting anything, but there it was, an envelope with my father's slanted handwriting. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Dad wasn't one for words, and letters from him usually contained a few lines about the weather and maybe a note about keeping your chin up. This one was different. Martin, got your letter, read it twice. Didn't think I'd ever see the day you'd question orders and still make me proud for it. When I was your age, I followed every rule in the book. Lost good men doing it. I thought discipline was the only thing that kept us alive. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was decency. Same as you found out there in the cold, I used to tell you heart gets you hurt. Truth is, heart's what got me through 30 years. It just took me a lifetime to admit it. You did right, kid. Dad. I read it 3 times. The words blurred a little around the edges. Then I folded the letter neatly and slipped it inside my journal, right next to the medal and the chocolate wrapper. That night, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. The moon hung over the camp like a watchful eye. I stood outside, letting the air bite my skin, and thought about my father sitting in his recliner back home. We hadn't spoken properly in years, 2 soldiers too stubborn to find middle ground, but now, across an ocean and a lifetime of silence, it felt like we'd finally saluted each other from a distance. The following morning, the general found me by the fuel depot. "Morning, Captain," he said. "Morning, sir." He looked at me for a second, then said, "You heard from home." I blinked. "Yes, sir. How'd you know?" He smiled. "When soldiers get mail, their faces change. Doesn't take a psychologist." I laughed softly. "My father, he's proud. I think that's new." "Good. That's rare, too." He paused. "You should hold on to that. The pride of a parent means more than 1,000 salutes." I nodded. "Yes, sir." He shifted his gaze toward the convoy line forming at the gate. "You know, Hoffman, most people think command is about control. It's not. It's about stewardship. You reminded me of that." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. Just keep leading the way you do. Quietly." He walked off, his son trailing behind him, carrying a small NATO flag in his hand. That afternoon, I had a break between briefings. I took a walk outside the wire along the same route our convoy had once taken. The road was quieter now. The snow melted into thin streams that trickled down into the fields. I found the broken fence line where I'd stopped that day. The footprints were gone, but the place still felt alive. I knelt, brushed the dirt, and whispered, "You're safe now." A gust of wind moved through the trees, cold but gentle. I stood for a moment longer before heading back to base. Later that week, our rotation was set to end. We'd be returning stateside in a month. I packed my few things, photos, journal, letters, and looked at the medal again. I thought about mailing it home to Dad, but something told me to keep it. It wasn't really a decoration. It was a reminder of who I wanted to keep being. That evening, Miller stopped by my tent. "Heard you're heading back soon," he said. "Yeah, looks like it." He grinned. "You going to miss all this snow?" "About as much as I miss field rations." He laughed. "You know, Captain, I still tell new guys about that story. The one with the lady and her kid." I raised an eyebrow. "You do?" "Yeah, teaches them that orders are important, but so is your gut. Figure that's a lesson worth keeping alive." I smiled. "You're turning into a philosopher, Miller." "Don't tell the others. It'll ruin my reputation." We shared a laugh that lingered longer than usual, like both of us knew we were nearing the end of something we'd never forget. That night, before lights out, I opened my journal one last time. I slid Dad's letter beside the chocolate wrapper and the metal. 3 pieces of metal, paper, and foil. But somehow they carried the weight of everything I'd learned. I wrote one final line underneath them. Honor isn't what people give you. It's what you keep alive when no one's looking. Then I closed the journal and let the silence settle around me. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt cruel. It just felt honest. The day we flew home, the sky over Germany was the same pale gray as when I'd arrived months earlier. The convoy yard buzzed with the rhythm of goodbye, boots stomping, trucks idling, men shouting over engines. Every soldier has that moment when deployment ends, when the noise of duty quiets just long enough for memory to catch up. For me, it wasn't pride I felt, it was gratitude. I watched the NATO flags flutter one last time and thought of the woman and her boy. They were safe somewhere, maybe home again, maybe building a new life. The image of their faces had softened into something less haunting, more like a reminder that small kindnesses ripple farther than orders ever reach. The flight back to the States was long and sleepless. The cabin smelled of canvas and cold metal, but the mood was light. Miller sat beside me, headphones in, tapping his boot to a country song leaking faintly from the earpieces. Every so often, he'd glance over and grin, as if to say, "We made it." We landed in Quantico before dawn. The tarmac shimmered under floodlights, and I felt that odd, disorienting warmth of being home, like stepping into an old photograph that no longer fit quite right. The debriefs, the medical checks, the paperwork, it all blurred together. By afternoon, I found myself standing outside the administrative building with my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, staring at the U.S. flag. The air smelled of pine instead of diesel. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that. A staff sergeant handed me a sealed envelope. Captain Hoffman from headquarters. Congrats, sir. Inside was an invitation. A small recognition ceremony in D.C. for humanitarian service during NATO operations. No red carpets, no television cameras, just quiet acknowledgement. I almost didn't go, but something in me wanted to close the circle properly. 2 weeks later, I stood in a modest hall inside the Pentagon. The room was filled with familiar uniforms and faces I didn't know. On the wall hung the Army motto in bold letters, 3 words I'd recited 1,000 times but only truly understood now. Major General Cole stepped up to the podium, his voice carried easily but warmly. We're here today to recognize an officer who reminded us that sometimes leadership isn't about orders. It's about choosing humanity when no one is watching. He motioned for me to stand beside him. I did, straight-backed, trying not to show how fast my heart was beating. He looked out at the small audience, then back at me. Captain Martin Hoffman did what soldiers have done for generations. He saw someone in need and acted. No hesitation, no calculation, no reward in mind, just duty shaped by compassion. He pinned a new ribbon on my uniform, simple, silver-edged. Then he shook my hand and said, "For reminding us what honor looks like when it's quiet." The applause was soft, restrained, the kind that feels more like respect than noise. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, General Cole's wife and son approached. The boy had grown taller, his English smoother. He handed me a small drawing, a stick-figure soldier standing beside a little boy under falling snow. At the top, in shaky letters, it said, "Thank you, hero." I crouched to meet his eyes. "You're the hero, kid. You survived." He smiled shyly, then saluted. I returned it, crisp and proud. Later, standing by the windows overlooking the Potomac, General Cole joined me. "You ever think about staying in?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But wherever I go next, I'll remember this." "All of it," he nodded. "Good, then I know we'll be in safe hands." We shook hands one final time. There were no speeches left to make. That night, back in my small apartment in Virginia, I unpacked my things. The medal went into a drawer, with a letter from Dad beside it and the crinkled chocolate wrapper tucked safely inside my journal. I lit a single candle on the table, a habit I'd picked up overseas, and sat quietly, listening to the hum of home. I thought about all the stories older soldiers used to tell about courage and battle, sacrifice and loss. Mine was smaller, quieter, but no less true, sometimes redemption. Doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in on a cold day, shakes your hand, and disappears again. Before bed, I wrote one last entry in my journal. If you ever doubt what difference one act of kindness makes, remember this. Someone you'll never meet might still be alive because of it, and that's enough to make a lifetime meaningful. I closed the book, set it on the nightstand, and let the quiet fill the room. Then, softly, for whoever might listen, I spoke the same words I'd want my father, or any soldier, or any human being to hear. Be kind when no one's watching. Lead with your heart, even when the world tells you not to. That's the only kind of honor that lasts. If this story moved you even a little, share it. Tell someone that decency still matters, that small things still count, because sometimes that's how the world changes, one quiet act at a time.